doing our brown bag remotely again this week, and I'm doing a rather topical topic this time on the Spanish flu of 1918. As we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the territory of the Sinixt, Sioux, Ktunaxa, and Secwepemc First Nations. So there are multiple theories about how the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 started, but there were cases reported at an army base in Kansas in March of 1918, believed to have been caused by contamination from a nearby farm, and it is possible that the disease spread from there. It was given the moniker Spanish flu in about May of 1918, when Spain, which was a neutral country, was one of the few that was freely able to report on the spread of the disease. Over the course of the pandemic, it is estimated that up to 100 million people died, between 3 to 5% of the world's population. 50,000 Canadians died, including 37 people from Revelstoke and District. The majority of those who died were between the ages of 20 to 40. The cause of death was often given as pneumonia, which was a common progression of the disease. By September, the Spanish flu was widespread in eastern Canada, and it was in Revelstoke by the end of October. World War I was just coming to an end, and there was scarcity throughout the country. People had been on food rations for some time, and the economy was in a slump due to the 4-year war effort. Revelstoke, with a population in city and district of around 5,000 to 6,000, had not escaped the ravages of the war. More than 800 men signed up to serve, and close to 100 of them died in the conflict. By the end of October, there were several flu cases in Revelstoke, and people were looking at ways to stop the spread. This ad appeared in the October 23, 1918 issue of the Revelstoke Review. We have the preventatives against the influenza epidemic. Spray your nose and throat daily with our antiseptic solution. Atomizers and sprays of all kinds. Millions of germs destroyed in your nose and throat by the above treatment. The Canadian Pacific Railway was taking precautions to stop the spread of the flu. There were very few roads built at the time, so railway travel was the main mode of transportation. The company issued stringent instructions regarding the cleaning of all passenger cars and stations. The instructions were prepared by Dr. Milton Hershey, the consulting chemist to the Railway War Board of Canada. By the end of October, there were several cases of flu in town and several people in the hospital. The newspaper was being overly optimistic, though, and stated, "The local cases of Spanish flu are reported to be well in hand, and it is hoped that it will soon be a thing of the past." Compared with many other places throughout the country, Revelstoke has been extremely fortunate. Well, that quickly changed. The schools, churches, and theaters, and all public gatherings were closed under a flu ban order by October 23rd. The nursing staff was overwhelmed, and many local women were assisting them, including members of the Women's Canadian Club and several local teachers. Revelstoke had several nurses on staff, and also ran a nurses training school through Queen Victoria Hospital. This photograph here shows a graduating class of one of the nurses training classes. In a newspaper on Halloween, October 31st, there was a quest that any young people engaged in any Halloween pranks, including the shooting of firecrackers or making any unusual noise, do not come near enough to disturb the patients in the Queen Victoria Hospital. By the newspaper of November 7th, 1918, the first deaths were being reported. 7 people died between October 30th and November 5th. All but 2 of them were under the age of 45. One of those who died was Harry Turnross, age 23. By the end of the epidemic, one of his sisters and one of his brothers had also died. Mrs. Maria Fiocco, age 29, died. She was the wife of Philip Fiocco, a well-known local baker, and the mother of Kay Fiocco, later Kay Baruski. There was concern that the flu epidemic was having an effect on the Victory Loan campaign. The campaign was a nationwide fundraising effort to fund the war effort. And there was concern that because the war was ending, interest in funding the campaign was lessening, and the effects of the flu were just making that even harder for them to raise the money that was needed to complete the war effort and to make sure that the soldiers were looked after until they were able to all get home. The newspaper said Spanish influenza must not be permitted to interfere with the success of the Victory Loan campaign. The epidemic may add to the difficulties of floating the loan, but these difficulties must be overcome. Spanish flu is not holding back our men at the front, and it won't be allowed to hold back the Victory Loan canvassers at home. On November 11th, 1918, the Great War came to an end after 4 long years. Revelstoke celebrated the end of the war with a huge outdoor gathering and a parade that wound its way throughout the entire city, which at that time was mostly between Farwell and Downey Street, and the parade wound all through downtown as well. Speeches were given outside of City Hall. There didn't seem to be any concern about the outdoor gathering, and there was certainly no social distancing taking place. The war had taken a toll on Revelstoke, with hundreds of men leaving to fight and close to 100 lost. Clearly, the need to celebrate outweighed the concern about the flu at that time. The parade was delayed until 12:30 due to the funeral of Alan MacDonald, age 29, a returned soldier who died on November 10th. Before his service on the war, he was a CPR trainman in Revelstoke. He had been invalided home due to trench fever in December of 1917, and in the fall of 1918 contracted the flu and died of pneumonia. After his funeral in the Catholic Church, his body was taken to the station, where he was sent to his family home in Nova Scotia for burial. Between November 6th and 11th, another 9 people died. They were all between the ages of 22 and 48. One of them was Tomi Irene Hashimoto, a woman aged 30, whose body was shipped to Vancouver for burial, and Gus Leonard, age 48, of Albert Canyon, who left a wife and 7 children. He had been sick for only 3 days before his death. Sunday, November 17th, was set by the Dominion government as National Thanksgiving Day to celebrate the peace. Churches throughout the Dominion were requested to hold special Thanksgiving services. In a reply to Reverend B.C. Freeman regarding the above notice, Mayor McKinnon stated that it would not be possible to hold a service in Revelstoke owing to the decision by the medical health officer, Dr. Hamilton, that flu conditions did not warrant it. Though Ottawa ended up postponing the service until December 1st, due to the prevalence of flu in Western Canada, the East had already mostly recovered from the pandemic by that time. This is Dr. J.H. Hamilton on the left. He was a well-known doctor in Revelstoke. He was also a medical officer with the 54th Kootenai Battalion and served overseas. At the time of the flu outbreak in Revelstoke, he was the local health officer. All of the local decisions about bans and whatever was to be done regarding the flu was being made locally by Dr. Hamilton. We didn't seem to have a provincial spokesperson as we do now in Dr. Bonnie Henry. So Dr. Hamilton was the one that was making the decisions. There was a note in the newspaper on November 14th that some of the volunteer nurses, Miss Eden and Miss Urquhart and Miss Cathels, who were all teachers, and Miss Robinson, who had all been volunteering as nurses. And it said they had themselves been afflicted by the flu, but were all on the road to recovery and doing well. The nursing staff was augmented by the addition of several other women, mostly wives of local businessmen. It was Mrs. Blacklock, Mrs. Hamilton, the wife of Dr. Hamilton, Mrs. Swanee, and Mrs. Smythe. It also mentioned in that issue of the paper that McDonald's drugstore had been hard hit by the flu. It said Mr. and Mrs. McDonald and Lem Briggs, who was their clerk, had all been laid up with it at one time. They had a couple of people that were filling in for them, but it said both Mr. McDonald and Lem Briggs are on the job again, none the worse for their experience. This is a photograph of McDonald's drugstore That is where the Taco Club is now. It also mentioned that, said the attention of the local church members is drawn to the fact that the expenses of the church continue, whether the services are being held or not. Mr. Walter Buse will be pleased to receive contributions for the Methodist Church. So just as we're experiencing now, a lot of the nonprofits, the churches are experiencing a downturn in donations. So it was an issue back then as well. At that date, which is the middle of November, Dr. Hamilton at that time was of the opinion that they would need at least one more week of closed schools, churches, and theater because there were still several active cases of flu. He did say at that time, though, that the flu conditions were improving and there had been fewer cases recorded, and that he was hoping that the worst was now over. But then there were 3 more deaths between November 14th and the 18th. One of them was Luigi DeMarco, age 22, who was the brother of Maria Fiocco, who had just died earlier in November. On November 17th, at an informal meeting of the health department and the representatives of the school board, there was a consensus that it would be wise to keep the schools closed for the balance of the school term, especially in view of the fact that only a month of the term remained, and several of the teachers who had been acting as nurses were not yet in fit shape to resume teaching. The decision would rest with Medical Health Officer Dr. Hamilton, but at that point they were considering keeping the schools closed until January. But as it turned out, the ban was lifted at the end of by the end of November. There was talk in the newspapers then of trying to find vaccines, and there was some work being done in the Nicholson Laboratories, were the first in Canada to prepare a Spanish influenza vaccine. That more than 200,000 doses had been administered in Toronto, as well as in many municipalities throughout Ontario. And they were hoping that this vaccine would be available quite soon. There was also a note in the newspaper asking people to shop early and relieve the clerks. It said influenza finds easy victims among the tired and overworked clerks, especially those having colds. A number of merchants in town have been hard-pressed recently, owing to late shopping on Saturday. It would prove a great relief to many of the stores if the public would be more considerate and order early in the day. Telephone orders can easily be made in the forenoon, and personal purchases early in the afternoon, and that would prove a great boon to drivers and clerks who are worn out by the Saturday rush when 6 o'clock arrives. There was also a note then that one of the church bazaars of St. Peter's Anglican Church was postponing their bazaar indefinitely. Another 6 deaths took place between November 21st and 26th, all between the ages of 26 and 50. On November 26th, Mary Bell Smith, age 26, died. She'd lived in Revelstoke for 8 years. She left behind her husband and 2-year-old son. But finally it was announced that the flu ban was to be conditionally lifted. The churches were going to open the coming Sunday and schools on Monday. The medical health officer was warning citizens to continue to practice cautionary measures. The clergymen were hoping to have a united public Thanksgiving service, but Dr. Hamilton considered that would not be in the best interests of the public health and limited Sunday gatherings at present to the separate congregations meeting in their own churches. The opening was conditional on conditions continuing to improve. The lifting of the ban included the YMCA, all of the local lodges, societies, and theaters. The only exception at that time was the Big Eddy School, where there were still considerable flu cases active. The Empress Theatre reopened on Monday, December 2nd. It said it had been thoroughly fumigated and ventilated, and the bill was opening with Mary Pickford in Armillery of the Clothesline Alley, which is one of her greatest motion pictures. On There were a couple more deaths reported on December 5th. Thomas Goad, a miner who's age 50, died on November 29th. And Elsie Hall, age 25, of Hall's Landing, died on November 30th. So special Thanksgiving services were held in all the city churches on Sunday. The spirit of thanksgiving to God for the victory of the Allies being manifested throughout the addresses and the music specially prepared for the occasion. Notwithstanding the recent flu epidemic, all the churches were well attended. There was a note in the December 19th issue of the paper that Mary Castellana Moore had died on December 14th, age 33, of pneumonia after flu. She was the wife of J.H. Moore, who'd previously been the editor of the Revelstoke Review newspaper. The paper said the circumstances in connection with Mrs. Moore's death were particularly sad, owing to the fact that she had only recently returned to the city from a visit to relatives in Manitoba, where she had contracted a severe attack of pneumonia, and a wire was sent to Mr. Moore, who also came down with the disease. After weeks of suffering in Manitoba, the family, including their two little girls, Winnie and Marjorie, returned to Revelstoke. Less than a week after returning to their home on 2nd Street West, Mrs. Moore was taken to the hospital, where she died. Flu had developed into pleurisy and pneumonia. There was a lot of ads in the paper really throughout, not just at this time, but really all the time, about patent medicines. And this is an ad for gin pills and connecting them with the Spanish flu. It says, everybody knows that one of the most depressing and dangerous complaints resulting from the attack of Spanish influenza is weakened kidneys. I'm not sure how everybody knew that. I didn't know that. That might have just been their comment trying to sell their gin pills. That hundreds of persons are now suffering worry and annoyance from kidney disorders because they failed to remedy the detrimental effects left by the flu. Goes on to say, gin pills have always been accepted as the universal remedy for kidney and bladder trouble. Now they make good again as the best remedy for after the flu convalescence. There was another death on December 26th when Siegfried Johnson, age 38, died. He was a CPR engineer. His body was sent to Highland Park, Alberta for burial. And on December 26th, they also noted that the flu ban was on again, with a second wave of the disease coming through. But the news of the putting on again of the flu ban in Revelstoke came as a big surprise to citizens this morning, especially in view of a number of Christmas week entertainments and activities throughout the city. The fact that there were practically 2 full weeks in which no flu existed in the city caused many to feel that the trouble was over. But the second wave, which is general throughout the country, has rendered it absolutely necessary to take every precaution. And it went on to say that there weren't many cases at present, but it was hoped that the new ban would be a safeguard against the second wave coming through. So there was an automatic closure of churches, schools, and theaters, and any post-Christmas entertainments had to be canceled. There were 3 more deaths at the end of December. In this case, a 5.5-year-old boy named Ichiro Shigawa died, and Thomas Gillespie, aged 59, a CPR bridge foreman, died on December 28th at the age of 31 years. And in that case, it said that there was a very sudden onset. He had only been in hospital for a few hours and had been in apparent good health almost up until the day of his death. On December 29th, Gustav Turnross died, age 22, and he was the 3rd member of the Turnross family to die. He had been sick for several weeks. On January 2nd, 1919 newspaper, there was a little note said, an absolute cure for pneumonia. And it said that it was coming from the Office of the Surgeon General of the U.S. at Washington. It said, saturate a ball of cotton as large as a 1-inch marble with spirits of alcohol, 3 drops of chloroform to each ball of cotton. Place between patient's teeth. Let the patient inhale the fumes for 15 minutes and then rest for 15 minutes. Repeat 15 times. The result will be that the lungs will expand to their normal condition. In 24 hours, the patient will be out of danger. Change the cotton twice in each 15-minute treatment. And that was apparently coming from the Surgeon General of the U.S. at Washington. So it's kind of interesting that we're also now getting sort of fake cures coming out of Washington. But I laughed when I first read this, thinking how ridiculous it is. But we only have to look at our current Facebook feeds to realize that fake cures are still being promoted today. On January 9th, the newspaper had 3 more deaths to report. Doris Fleedham, age 23, died on January 23rd. She was the wife of Fred Fleedham and left her husband and a 2-year-old daughter. And then 2 3-year-olds died, and those were the youngest children that I saw that died in the flu epidemic. There's a boy named Masao Shigawa, age 3, and another little 3-year-old Stanley Francis Davis, the son of Mr. and Mrs. Pete Davis, lived on 2nd Street West. Also mentioned in the newspaper at this time that one of the local ministers, B.C. Freeman, had issued a 4-page paper which will be published during the time the flu ban remains on. Said, failing to reach the people through the usual way, Reverend Freeman takes recourse to the wise use of printer's ink. And there were still several new cases being reported in town at that time. Finally, on January 16th, 1919, the newspaper reported that the flu ban would be coming off the following Sunday. Churches would be open on Sunday, and schools open on Monday, and the Empress Theater on Monday night. So this is the middle of January, and the second ban has come off. So it said there was general rejoicing in the town. The ban had been on and off, but mostly on since middle of October, and the second ban had started on December 26th. So the inroads made into the year's work at the schools will no doubt be quite manifest, and the teaching staff will be glad to get down to business again. There were very few cases remaining in the town at that time. The last reported death was mentioned on January 30th, 1919, when it was reported that Annie Mae Joliffe McSorley had died suddenly of the flu. She had formerly been in the staff of the telephone company and had recently, in the previous year, had married and just had a 4-week-old infant daughter at the time of her death. That daughter was Lorna D'Arcangelo, who was well known in town for quite a few years. Annie Joliffe was just 19 years old at the time of her death. And that was the last recorded death in town. In the book by Ruby Nobbs, Revelstoke History and Heritage, she tells the story of during the flu. She was born in 1907, so she would have been 11 years old at the time of the flu epidemic. And she tells that everybody in her family got sick except for her. And she was nursing the family, and the doctor wanted to put her parents in the hospital because they were very ill. But the resources at the hospital were really stretched, and Dr. Hamilton came to check on the family and said that he thought that Ruby, 11-year-old girl, was doing a really creditable job nursing her family. So the family stayed at home and she continued to look after them. She never got the flu herself. So between the end of October and the end of January, 37 people from Revelstoke and the surrounding area had died. Revelstoke had seen the loss of almost 100 men during the 4 years of the war, and then saw the ravages of the flu pandemic. The community recovered quickly. There was certainly no more discussion of the flu in the newspapers afterward. The city was dealing with the after effects of the war and tried to rebuild the community and care for the returning soldiers. The flu was just another disruption on top of the major disruption of the war years. There were bans in other years as well. In 1920, there were bans mostly in the schools because of of another flu outbreak that didn't prove as nearly as deadly. There was only a couple of recorded deaths, but there was also a measles outbreak as well. So the schools were closed on a rotating basis depending on where the disease was at in each school. And they also had a ban in place in the theater where children under 12 weren't allowed to attend. But that one didn't last too long. And then again in 1927, the disease known as poliomyelitis, it was all polio, or also referred to as infantile paralysis, was sweeping through the city in the fall of 1927. And there were 4 deaths, and those hit very young children. All of the children who died were under 7. The ban was just in place for a couple of weeks in that case, and then that subsided. So that's it for today. I hope that everybody stays safe and well, and thank you for tuning in.